All right. Good afternoon and happy Friday. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jamie Lovelace, and I'm a recruitment consultant with PSG Global Solutions, and I'm based out of Austin, Texas. Joining us today is Miss Allison Eben, the program manager with Health Advocate in Boise, Idaho. Today, she's going to talk about the crucial role of the on site trust and safety counselors. Allison, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Jamie. As she mentioned, my name's Allison. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I'm actually based in San Diego, California, but I oversee the Boise, Idaho office for Health Advocate. And yeah, we have two other sites as well. One's over in El Paso, which my colleague Ashley oversees, and then we have one as well in Port St. Lucie, which my other colleague Gabby oversees, and I think they're tuning in today as well.
Awesome. So today we're going to go over the roles. You do have a presentation. Do you just want to go ahead and get it kicked off?
Sure, thanks so much. So, like I mentioned, just wanted to tell a little bit about my background additionally, and then give a little bit of background on Health Advocate very briefly. So, as I mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. Over the past 6 years, I've worked in a pretty wide variety of settings, in outpatient health and mental health, inpatient health and mental health. More recently, in emergency medicine, telepsychiatry, and have worked on some other startups. And this is a new line of business for Health Advocate. So it's a program that myself and the other two program managers are actively building out. Health Advocate has historically been an EAP company, so it's great because we have some resources from our EAP side of our line of business. But like I mentioned, this is newer for Health Advocate, and we're really excited. So, just to kick us off, I wanted to just talk about a few of the key takeaways that we're going to go through today to give folks an idea of the flow of the presentation. Um, we're going to start off talking a little bit about what trust and safety actually is. It's a large part of the questions that I get regarding um, like what is trust and safety and kind of why is it applicable to this role and how does it intersect with mental health. Taking a look then at kind of how trust and safety exists in today's tech landscape, and from there talking about content moderation and what that looks like in roles and responsibilities and challenges that content moderators face, into some of the clinical implications of the work that content moderators do on their mental health, and then talking more so at the end about some of the wellness initiatives that we've been building out, and talking more about specifically the trust and safety counselor role that Health Advocate has been hiring for, and just explaining more actually like what it is and why it's valuable. So a really big part of the questions that I get from a lot of my colleagues in the mental health field, as I mentioned, is what actually is trust and safety? Like, I've never heard of this field. Trust and safety refers to a comprehensive approach and a pretty wide variety of things that allow us to maintain safety and trust in online environments. It encompasses a super wide range of strategies, policies, practices, products, and technologies that assist in keeping users safe and maintaining their well-being. Um, Sometimes people are like, what are examples, right, of trust and safety? What does it actually look like? In practicality, a lot of the functionality of applications on social media platforms actually fall underneath the umbrella of trust and safety. So, for example, when we think about different social media platforms, we can, think about privacy settings, how we can manage who can see our posts, what can be shared to public, what can be shared to friends, what's private. Content moderation, as I mentioned before, is a very large part of trust and safety. There's other roles within trust and safety aside from content moderation, but content moderation falls in kind of two different buckets. There's machine learning parts of content moderation, which is using like apologies, algorithms and AI to filter content that may be deemed based on different mechanisms put in place to be concerning or unsafe, or as we call in trust and safety, egregious. And then we have the human aspect of it, where we have human moderators filtering out harmful content. There's other types of trust and safety mechanisms that are in place. When we think about like messaging apps, I know my partner and I, we use WhatsApp a lot. When we think about WhatsApp, right, that's an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, right? All the messages are encrypted, which ensures that conversations remain private and secure. Blocking features, right? If someone's harassing you or you're getting messages that are unwanted, a safety feature is blocking. It's something that I think a lot of us wouldn't really think about as a trust and safety feature, but it actually is. Disappearing messages is another trust and safety feature. It's something as a social worker myself, I find to be super fascinating when we think about um, how much maybe we take that for granted for folks who might not be in a safe situation and are concerned if someone was able to access their technology, what it would mean if they were able to see their messaging. So disappearing messages, sending out to say, "Hey, I'm really in a bad situation. I need some help," and having that be able to delete itself simultaneously in 30 seconds or a minute is something that I think a lot of us maybe take for granted. But a lot of trust and safety mechanisms are actually really protective of users. It's just things that we might not think of on a daily basis as being um, so critical for certain users' needs and their safety. Another example that I had mentioned in a previous presentation that I did, which has been around for a really long time, is child safety features. We see that on tech. We see that on search engine content blocking. So blocking explicit content from showing up in search engine uh, querying, and that's obviously important when it comes to child safety and maybe for our own safety. Um, and then there's a pretty wide variety of other, trust and safety features when we think about like e-commerce platforms. So making sure that buyers have protection from spam, scam, fraud, and things in that arena. So it's a very wide umbrella. More specifically in the role that I focus on in this program, it's along the lines of content moderation, which I'll speak more about later. But trust and safety is like everywhere. It's something that I think a lot of us just haven't known that it's actually categorized in this field, and that there's actually a field that builds these products and features to keep us safe every day. Another question that I get is like, why does this matter? Like, why is it important? Um, Trust and safety is super important because it not only contributes to fostering healthy online communities and promoting digital literacy, but it also protects vulnerable populations from online threats. And vulnerable populations can be a wide variety of folks. I think off the top of my head of children and adolescents. I'm a millennial. I grew up on a lot of tech. My parents, not so much. But I know that as we progress into more and more tech, uh, younger and younger generations are accessing things like social media platforms, different apps like Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max. Um, and so the ability for folks to be impacted by egregious or explicit content is on the rise. And there's a lot of new and emerging challenges that have come up in this field to continue to protect users, which is something that I'll get into a little bit later. So when we talk about roles and like responsibilities of trust and safety, it can be varying. There's different aspects of trust and safety, as I've mentioned. I know from the standpoint that I'm speaking about, it's more so about user protection, safety of users, but there's also other types of responsibilities for folks who work cross-functionally within trust and safety. The main overarching goal, as I mentioned, though, and responsibility of folks who work in trust and safety is to develop and enforce community guidelines. And this is something that plays such a pivotal role in making sure that online behavior remains acceptable and that content meets standards for what we would define as appropriate, essentially. I know I have content moderation there in bold. That's a large part of responsibilities. A lot of different types of content moderation, which I'll get into. I think it's on the next slide. And then kind of what happens if there is content that's egregious or inappropriate or harmful, which falls into more of the law enforcement side of things, or the legal and policy aspects of some of these roles. So investigating reports of abuse, neglect, and misconduct. And when we talk about impact, right, as I mentioned, why is the work important? It's important because the impact is huge. When we talk about impact, we're talking about mitigating risk of harm, ensuring that there's trust among users, right? If folks don't feel safe on a platform, or they don't feel that their data is protected or that they're protected, the likelihood that they're going to use an app or a product or a service is going to be impacted. And when we think about that on a large scale, right, we think about what is social media? It allows us to connect with other people. I lived for a time in Spain, and I use, various platforms to connect with folks that live there. And I use other types of communication to contact some of my colleagues that work with me on some of these projects throughout the US and actually globally. And if we don't have confidence in the technology or the platform and that it's keeping our information, or in healthcare, our protected health information, our PHI safe, it makes it really difficult to get user buy-in, and it limits our ability to communicate and, quite frankly, socialize with other people. Um, and on the end of collaboration, right, trust and safety is super wide-reaching. When we think about the variety of roles in this aspect, um, trust and safety folks collaborate with people cross-functionally on different product features, as I mentioned, right? Disappearing messages might be a great example of a product feature that was created out of this field. With legal teams, policy development, I know there's a lot of talks currently within Congress in different areas of the House of Representatives and the Senate to increase protection for users. And some of that comes out of, unfortunately, incidences and events that have occurred on certain social media platforms that impact users. And lastly, we talk about, right, law enforcement, apologies before I meant legal teams and policy development, but with law enforcement to make sure that reports of egregious content are taken seriously, and that folks that are impacted by content are provided the support that they need, and that it doesn't continue. So when we talk about trust and safety in today's digital landscape, trust and safety has evolved significantly over the past couple of years, and even more so in the past year, I would say. There are a lot of challenges that persist in this arena. For one example, right, we have escalation of online harassment. There's been a disproportionate increase in targeted harassment and cyberbullying across social media platforms. We see that in some of the impacts on children and adolescents who use social media, and kind of how that's impacted the mental health of a lot of younger adults, adolescents, and children today. I know that especially during the pandemic, when there wasn't a means for face-to-face communication, there was a significant rise in targeted harassment and cyberbullying. And with that, it makes it really challenging to detect and mitigate harassment in real time. It's something that we as folks in the trust and safety field have been working significantly on improving, but it's still a large challenge. Another piece another challenge that remains as a very large hurdle is managing the spread of misinformation. I know there's been a lot of recent, like, current events in the last, let's say, 5 years that have happened, and there's been a continual increase of the rapid dissemination of false information, particularly during like crises. I'm thinking, right, let's say the pandemic, recent elections, different types of, you know, governmental events, right? Congress, I'm thinking of specifically, not to get deep in the weeds there, but um, it has been very difficult in this specific challenge to distinguish between harmful misinformation and free speech. And that's something that's kind of been towing the line for a very long time and has become one of the more, I think, prevalent challenges within trust and safety. Um, One area that I find fascinating within trust and safety, and that remains, I would say, the largest challenge at this moment, and that has increased over the past year, has been evidence of new forms of harmful content. When we think about AI, right, we think of some of the great uses of technology, great ways that we can, use AI to make our lives easier. But in the same vein, there's been a very large growth of the use of deepfake imaging and manipulated media to deceive and harm folks. Um, I recently was reading an article about the use of manipulated media to uh, recreate a person's voice to call another family member to scam and fraud someone out of money. And when we think about that, like, it's actually like mind blowing. Um, and the difficulty in this area is that oftentimes new types of harmful content evolve faster than detection technologies. Like, how do we mitigate this if all of this is evolving faster than we can produce a technology or a product to lessen it? I love these two images on the right. This is from one of the AI generated imaging services. And I love asking people this, like, let's test your skills. Which of the two images here is real? Is the top image real or is the bottom image real? One of these images is created by AI, which I think is absolutely nuts to think about. But the image on the bottom is real. The image on the top was created by AI. This is not a real person. This is a fake image. It looks super, super accurate. The eyebrows, the facial features, very distinct. Um, so, I mean, AI has a lot of really great uses. Machine learning, amazing, has brought tech a really long way, but on the flip side, that's created a lot of challenges for the spread of like deepfake imaging and impacts of that on just regular people. I'm thinking specifically one celebrity who had explicit deep fake images created of her that were spread across the internet and were very egregious, and it looked real. And so sometimes I think about these things and wonder kind of what does that mean in the future for like protection of like children, youth, us as adults, when there is concern that maybe some of our images or information could be almost used against us. Um, the other challenge that I've mentioned that's really, really prevalent is the evolving regulatory landscape. The regulatory environment for online platforms and digital content is becoming increasingly complex and varied. Trust and safety folks have to navigate a huge amount of laws and regulations that differ across jurisdictions. Different countries and different regions have their own sets of rules governing data privacy, content moderation, and user safety. For instance, like what's considered harmful content or hate speech can vary significantly between countries. And there's also the fact that there are often inconsistent requirements. So platforms operating globally must comply with inconsistent and sometimes conflicting requirements from different legal systems, which makes it extremely challenging to create uniform policies and practices that satisfy all of the regulatory demands. And, in the same vein, there's a lot of emerging issues. Um, when I mentioned that a specific interest of mine that I find fascinating is the evidence of new forms of harmful content, this and how that with machine learning and AI has kind of, popped off. It's super interesting to me to think about how a lot of AI um, is bias. And this is something that I think a lot of people actually don't know about. So when we talk about an emerging issue, we think about addressing algorithmic bias and discrimination. A lot of the algorithms, I shouldn't say a lot, but some of the algorithms um, that AI uses are trained on large databases that reflect historical and societal biases. So if the training data contains biases, the algorithm learns and perpetuates these biases. For example, if a data set includes more negative interactions associated with a particular demographic, the algorithm might unjustly flag content from that demographic more often. Um, Another, example is combating online extremism and radicalization. Um, that's been growing in addition to spread of misinformation and kind of tapping into how can we mitigate this? How can we lessen it? Has been a very large challenge. Um, and then ensuring transparency and accountability in content moderation practices. I know that over the past several years, users have increasingly demanded transparency and accountability from platforms regarding their content moderation practices, which are extremely fluid. Something that I've learned more recently is the ever evolving landscape, as I mentioned, within the regulatory practices that need to be followed. Um, but it sometimes makes it confusing and difficult for trust and safety professionals to ensure that moderation decisions are transparent, consistent, and accountable. I see this in some of the recent, I shouldn't say recent, I would say the last few years, specific tech companies who have disbanded or removed all trust and safety technologies, policies, and procedures, and kind of the impact of that on folks who continue to use those platforms. So it's a very, very complicated landscape. There's not one right answer to kind of like fix these issues per se, especially with the way that technology has been evolving over the past several years, and more specifically with machine learning and AI over the past year, even. So I want to dig deeper into kind of what content moderation is, as it's the largest part of trust and safety that I interface with. Um, Sometimes people are confused what content moderation is, and I know for a lot of folks, they kind of think of user reported content. So if I see something that looks suspicious on a social media platform and I click that I want to report it because I think it's spam or suspicious, and then that gets sent off to a human being, it's actually much more than that. Content moderation, in its definition, involves actively monitoring and reviewing user-generated content posted on a variety of digital platforms to ensure compliance with community guidelines and standards. Um, so aside from the content that's user reported, so that us human beings are looking at, as I mentioned, there are algorithms that flag content that may be seen as egregious or concerning, and that's funneled over in a queue to other, human content moderators who review that information. Um, there's a lot of different types of content that's moderated. Um, the site that I work with in Boise moderates the least egregious content of the sites that we have. We talk on a spectrum of like how egregious content is. So from the end of least egregious to most egregious. Some of the types of content that fall along that spectrum that some of the folks that we work with is within like hate speech, harassment, graphic violence, gore, child abuse, child sexual abuse, exploitation, misinformation, financial frauds and scams. So there's a very large gamut of different types of content that our folks see. And wide variety of responsibilities, but reviewing, flagging, and tagging the content if it is egregious and not appropriate, and then sending that over for at times some of our law enforcement colleagues to take care of, or just removing it from platforms. I want to talk more about some of the challenges that content moderators face. So as I was mentioning, there's a pretty wide variety of types of content that we see, but a lot of it is disturbing. That in and of itself is something that's difficult to imagine. Seeing repeated, graphic imaging for several hours a day. I don't know that there's a lot of other jobs that you show up for and are like actively engaging with that you're like, okay, I'm going to see all of these types of egregious content for a set number of hours today. It's really difficult because content moderators are regularly exposed to disturbing and graphic content, and that is part of their job responsibility. And that constant exposure can have profound psychological effects. We think about increased stress, anxiety, and even trauma or vicarious trauma, which takes an emotional toll, right? It's like the second bullet point that I have there. There's a lot of legal and ethical dilemmas that kind of pop up for content moderators. They encounter content that can straddle the line between free speech and harmful behavior, as I mentioned before, which presents complex like legal and ethical dilemmas, making it difficult to kind of determine, is this egregious? Is it illegal? Is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it not ethical? And deciding whether to remove or allow content that may be offensive, but not necessarily in violation of platform guidelines, can be super challenging and can require a lot of nuanced judgment. I know when I was just in Boise a couple weeks ago, I was asking about the volume of content that they see. The site that I work with is smaller. They were mentioning to me that they review daily around 6,000 videos per day, which you think about that over the course of a year, that's a lot of videos. And I think with reviewing that many videos, I mean, no person there is reviewing 6,000 videos, but when you think of the span and the volume of seeing egregious content, it's difficult to make, countless decisions on a daily basis. Decision fatigue becomes real, can cause, or impact a state of mental exhaustion, I would presume, and reduce cognitive functioning. Burnout is another thing, which kind of is wrapped up into, I think, some of the above bullet points. The combination of exposure to disturbing content, the emotional toll, decision fatigue, all of these things can contribute to burnout. And burnout, as a mental health provider, I can say is something that's really difficult for folks to break out of. As I mentioned, compassion fatigue can be wrapped up into that. Compassion fatigue is also known as secondary traumatic stress. Happens when folks experience emotional exhaustion and reduced empathy as a result of continued exposure to other folks' suffering. It's something that we also see a lot in the healthcare field, unfortunately. And there's also an impact on personal beliefs and values. Regular exposure to diverse viewpoints, ideologies, controversial content can often take a toll and can challenge a moderator's personal beliefs and values, which can therefore lead to a lot of cognitive dissonance. Um, and also, I would take a guess that moderators might grapple with trying to reconcile their own moral compass with the platform's content policies at times, um, because there can be that variance there. I think it also falls into the difficulty of understanding, like, something might feel unethical, but it doesn't make it illegal, or that it's unethical, but it's not egregious enough that it needs to be taken down. So, I mean, in and of itself is an extremely challenging role. And kind of how I went into on the last, slide, there's a lot of clinical implications for content moderators. There's research on the impacts of viewing egregious content as a content moderator and what that does to a person's mental health. There's a high possibility for maladaptive coping, vicarious trauma stemming from repeated exposure to traumatic content can lead or may lead content moderators to engaging in poor or maladaptive coping mechanisms. Like the research specifically, excuse me, that my colleague had brought to my attention include things like overeating, increased alcohol consumption, poor um, relationships or negative impact on relationships, increase in risk of substance abuse. Um, when we talk about, dissociation as a coping mechanism for folks who experience trauma, that's a very big one. Um, Avoidance and withdrawal is often also a presenting symptom of burnout, in addition to vicarious trauma, and kind of wrapped up all in that area. And so when you think about content moderators and what their day to day looks like, I would presume that seeing egregious content may cause folks to, avoid certain types of social media in their own personal lives, or cause withdrawal from like social activities, hobbies, non-work related tasks. Um, because oftentimes when people are burned out, right, it's like I have had so much stimulation, so much external stimuli coming in that's impacting me. I need less. I need to be, I think at least that I need to be isolated to take a break. But that can be a slippery slope and can, lead to a lot of withdrawal and decreased like social supports, which is super important when we talk about um, you know support and protective factors for coping. Sleep disturbance was another one that's highlighted. Exposure to disturbing content can disrupt sleep patterns. This can lead to insomnia, nightmares, night terrors, things of that sort. And even like sleep deprivation can, if you're not sleeping well because of the impacts of vicarious trauma, that's definitely going to exacerbate any type of emotional distress or cognitive functioning that folks need to be able to live their lives and do things on a daily basis. Uh, Research also mentions intrusive thoughts regarding, content that they viewed, hyperarousal, which is a typical symptom of, you know, folks who experience traumatic events or traumatic stress. And then, as I mentioned with withdrawal, it goes hand in hand with having the inability to discuss what they see with loved ones. I would imagine that coming home and saying, "Hey, how'd your day go?" and then mentioning all of the egregious content that you see maybe doesn't feel super supportive or great for any type of relationship. Then also not having a space to discuss that type of content or debrief even can can be really heavy on people. Um, I mean, I think of a lot of first responders throughout the pandemic, myself included. I worked in the ER during the pandemic in New York City, and working alongside folks in traumatic experiences, it builds bonds, but not always healthy bonds, and it also feels very isolating to exist kind of in a like in a silo, right? Like, can feel very bizarre to have this is what I do at work, and then I have to come home and exist in such a different way. So a lot of our initiatives within Health Advocate and the role that we have within trust and safety and providing trust and safety counselors is to build, channels for support and build out wellness initiatives. Um, the importance of support, I think, is, I would say as a mental health professional, quite obvious, but the challenging nature of content moderation and the impacts of content moderation on content moderators' health and mental health it can be significant. The goals of the programming and the type of program that we do is to, mitigate stress, build resiliency, and a variety of different protective coping skills, draw from folks' strengths, and then also, do some solutions focused work in providing resources and referrals. And um, motivational interviewing is another great thing that we draw on to help folks feel better supported. In the role that I specifically work along that I oversee, I should say, of trust and safety counselors, we work within a couple different wellness initiatives. So we do a lot of wellness workshopping. I have a phenomenal colleague in Boise, Kayla, who does and supports different types of wellness workshops, which include types of community engagement, which I also have listed there, and building community in and outside of work, different types of self-care activities, EAP referrals, as I mentioned, trust and safe. I mean, apologies. Health Advocate has a phenomenal EAP service that we also provide to our content moderators. And then, as I mentioned, the trust and safety counselor role, which I'm going to explain a little bit more about, but having someone on site 24/7, a licensed professional to provide support as needed, to provide some, you know, very, very brief solution focused, motivational interviewing esque type of work. To be there if things escalate to the point of folks needing any type of crisis intervention or specific crisis referrals, safety planning and that aspect. I can say on the Boise end of things, given that our content is a lot less egregious, we really aren't on that far end of needing higher levels of support. But yeah, I see a question that just came in. What trends do you think are coming in trust and safety? Well, thank you for asking that, Gabby. I would say one of the largest trends and things that we as a company are trying to push along is that um, corporate mental health and providing on-site counselors can be done. It can be done in a way that's supportive, but also not overstepping. I think there's a lot of misconception about what this role that the folks that work under me and with me as trust and safety counselors do. It's as I've said to one of my colleagues, like, we're not doing EMDR, which is a type of trauma therapy with people on their lunch hour. That's not what we're doing, right? We're there to support people, to do check-ins, to provide referrals, to debrief. We are not primary clinical treaters. We're not the primary therapist for any of these folks. We're there to act as a bridge and as a support for people to um, be able to get whatever feels supportive for them. Maybe they don't want one-on-one therapy. Maybe they just want someone to lend like an ear to some of the other like psychosocial stressors that are happening in their life. And so when we think about the trends in trust and safety on the mental health side, it's to continue building out these programs and scaling them so that people who do view egregious content feel well supported. And we can improve the impacts and outcomes of people who do develop things like vicarious trauma or traumatic stress. Um, so I think the field is growing. I think the overlap of trust and safety and mental health and I should say wellness, has become much more has come much more into the spotlight to provide us to build programs like the one that I'm working on. Um, but I think that there are still areas for improvement, and that's where we're trying to move that needle. Um, I wanted to also talk very briefly about the importance of building rapport with content moderators. As I mentioned, the role that we do as trust and safety counselors, like on site, where these folks view and moderate content, it's not therapy, it's not one-on-one sessions, but I think of my social work background, and one of the largest measures of success for clients who come to therapy, and I mean in the therapy in the traditional sense, is the therapeutic relationship. How strongly does a person feel that they are connected or seen or understood by their therapist? And I think that translates too to the work that we do, even if it's not true clinical therapy. Um, the challenges that content moderators face on a daily basis are very unique. As I mentioned, we don't have a lot of other roles where people are like, yeah, I'm gonna go look at like horrible imaging for 5 hours per day. Um, what do I feel like could be the biggest challenge in building rapport with these content moderators? I think um, I think one of the largest challenges is the fact that it can feel, like I mentioned previously, that people who view this imaging um, can feel really isolated. It can feel like you don't even know what I've just looked at. How are you going to tell me how I can feel better? Um, and that's why I think it's really important for people who work as trust and safety counselors to have a very deep and niche understanding of what content moderation looks like, what types of egregious content folks are viewing, the specific implications of what that looks like, right? Someone who views content that's egregious among the realms of like child abuse or exploitation maybe is going to be impacted in a different way than someone who looks at financial frauds and scams. And so I think trying to bridge the gap of like our understanding as mental health professionals is one of the biggest challenges, right? Trust and safety, as I mentioned, is a field that I get asked almost every day, like, what is this? I think we, as mental health subject matter experts, can do a lot in understanding and reading the research on what are the best practices in supporting folks rather than presenting ourselves, I should say, supporting folks who do content moderation, rather than saying, like, historically, the research has shown that supporting folks means X, Y, or Z. We need to adapt that, right? As technology adapts and the changing digital landscape in trust and safety changes, we also need to change our approach. And we also need to listen to what people tell us is effective. What I might think is effective and what people who moderate content believe to be effective might not be the same things. And I think that comes to the point of acknowledging that each person's reality and lived experience is their own. It's not what we think it is, it's what they're telling us it is. And I think that we need to listen a lot closer to what people need. We can all enter right into the space with our own agendas and say, historically in mental health, this is what works. But content moderation is not something that has been around for a long time. So we need to get really innovative. to understand and to build programs that are actually meeting people where they're at and not where we think that they're at. Um, and I think just, being personable is one of the biggest things, being supportive and genuine and authentic, so that, we can, like I mentioned, mitigate some of the psychological impact that folks are, facing and the vicarious trauma that surfaces. And also making sure that we have appropriately tailored resources. As I mentioned, we have sites, one's in Boise, one's in El Paso, and one's in Port St. Lucie. So Idaho, Texas, Florida. The subcultures of each of these places are very different. This type of work cannot be a one size fits all, and that's where we have to really break down and break down our expectations and look at and serve the communities in which we're providing support to. So as I mentioned, the wellness counselor position that we are hiring for, it's not one-on-one counseling. I think that's a really big misconception. It's something that I've really been trying to explain to folks. We do provide one-on-one support sessions. They are in the format of what we call check-ins. They follow a very short-term, 15 to 20 minutes, usually, brief type of format. We do them monthly at a minimum. Folks are always welcome to come talk to any of the trust and safety counselors at any time for anything else that comes up. But at a minimum, our outreach to each content moderator is one time per month. We provide, consultation, recommendation. If someone says, hey, my family member needs this thing, it's impacting my life, it's impacting my family, I don't know what to do, let's consult and figure out a plan to, refer you over to some sliding scale family support or family therapy services. As I mentioned, in the same vein, referrals, right? Recently, there was someone who was looking for and feeling so significantly stressed about some legal resources. I mean, paying for legal, resources can be extremely costly. Coming to find out, oh, look at that. Health Advocate has some free legal services through their EAP, which I've also utilized myself when it comes to, creating advanced directives, healthcare proxy, all of these different things. In addition to, the one-on-one support sessions that we do, we provide workshopping, so programming, but also leading wellness initiatives. So, for example, at the Boise site, I know recently they did, as I mentioned, my colleague Kayla had hosted a build your own stress ball, where you could, build your own stress ball with a variety of different types of fillers, but also to, get some subliminal messaging in there of what actually is stress and how does it impact us both, psychologically, mentally, emotionally, physically. How does stress show up in different somatic ways, right? And breaking down and using language that's friendly to folks, not so clinical jargon-esque. We want to work with folks on building resiliency, growing coping skills, so that they can feel better equipped to do the work that they do. A lot of the content moderators that we see at our sites are on the younger end of the spectrum. So generally, I would say between the ages of 20 to 24, first job out of high school or first job out of college. So, I think for a lot of folks, this is their first encounter with any type of mental health support. So making sure that they have the resources that they need and can also learn some skills to kind of help them navigate the challenges and the unique role that they're in. And then also providing, assistance to on-site personnel, like I mentioned, crisis assessment, intervention, and support if someone is feeling significantly triggered by some of the content that they're viewing, and that's impacting maybe a pre-existing mental health condition or just them on any type of level. It's always good to have a licensed mental health professional on site to make sure that they are assessed appropriately and referred to any of the services that they might need. And if that does escalate to the point of them needing some type of emergency care, then like making sure that they get that support that they need. Um, and just being proactive in our outreach. A lot of the times we will there's a message from the supervisor, hey, this person seems a little bit off. I'm a little concerned about them. And then having some of our, on-site counselors just check in with them, see how they're doing, um, speaking with them privately one-on-one, seeing if there's anything that they need or support, or if maybe it's not even the job, um, or the content, right? Maybe it's just another life stressor and they needed just someone to lend an ear to. So the role, it's pretty holistic. It's not a true counseling position, but I think it's really important to do the work to support content moderators. If you're interested in applying for any of our sites, I think some of the FTE, the full-time positions are filled. You can check out the roles. It talks more about the roles and responsibilities on our health advocate website. I know Jamie kind of put it in the bottom there. If you want to reach out to me, if you have any questions, feel free. As I mentioned, my name is Allison. I'm the program manager for Boise. But yeah, I have questions. Somebody just put one in the chat. What do I think will be the hardest thing about this role? It's a good question. Nobody's actually ever asked me that. Um, I think that the role is very non-traditional. I think that sometimes some of us who've worked in such rigid, mental health roles or atmospheres have a very specific idea of like what mental health care looks like. That's not what this role is. Like I've worked, in emergency medicine psychiatry doing very, very detailed psychiatric evaluations. And I think a lot of us enter into some of our other, roles and very deep clinical mindset. I think one of the hardest things about the role is shifting from that to taking us a little bit of a step to the side to say, okay, this is not clinical work. This is subclinical work. This is solutions focused, brief, very brief intervention, motivational interviewing type of work. And if people do need those one-on-one services, we can refer them over to our EAP or some of our community referrals. But I think the most challenging thing is for folks to kind of take that deeply clinical hat off and kind of just like challenge the way that they viewed mental health support in another light. If anybody has any other questions, they can feel free to pop them in the chat, or you guys can just send me a direct message. I'm happy to answer any other questions.
Very insightful, Allison. Every time I listen to you, I always learn something new. I think my biggest takeaway was the AI images. I thought it was the other way around.
I know. It's like, so every time I see them, there's actually a website. I have to find it, but it talks specifically about deepfake imaging and provides you with a bunch of examples to guess which one is AI and which one is real. And it's really hard to tell. The website is whichfaceisreal.com.
I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm gonna get my son to do it with me. Well, thanks again for the presentation today, Allison. Very, very insightful. And again, as you mentioned, if anybody is interested in learning more, if you want to apply for the position, I did put a link in the chat. Today we're streaming on not only LinkedIn, but Facebook and YouTube as well. So I'll make sure all those have the links on there. Anything else you want to add, Allison?
No, I just, I think I should say yes. The only other thing I want to add is I think most of the FTE full-time roles are filled, but we are hiring at, I think across our sites for PRN, so part-time as needed positions. And we do offer services 24/7, 365. So we do have days and nights positions available.
Wonderful. Definitely a new and emerging field. Definitely something to look into if that's up your alley. Well, again, Allison,
Definitely.
thank you for joining us today. And I hope everybody has a happy Friday and a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jamie.